This is Thomas. And Thomas is well loved. Most of his markings have been rubbed off because Thomas is probably 20-some years old. But Thomas was a staple of our house for many years because Liam loved Thomas the Tank Engine, and of course all of Thomas the Tank Engine's friends. You had James, and you had Gordon, and then you had Diesel 10 was the bad guy. Is that right? So you had all these trains, and at any given time in Liam's life, his room was completely consumed with train tracks and all of the other things that went along with Thomas. And so we watched a lot of the Thomas cartoons, and we read the Thomas books, and we became very familiar with the whole Thomas the Tank Engine ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, one of the big goals for all of the tank engines, by the way, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can look it up on YouTube or something, all right? One of the big goals for all of the tank engines, or we call them train engines, was to be useful. They wanted Sir Topham Hatt, he was the boss, to look at them and say, "Oh, Thomas, you are a very useful engine." And sometimes they would argue over who was the most useful engine because James was boasty, braggy, and he'd be like, "I'm a very useful engine." But the reality was Sir Topham Hatt made it really clear what it meant to be a useful engine. To be a useful engine meant you didn't cause confusion and you didn't cause delay because the trains have to run on time. So as long as you weren't causing confusion or delay, then you were a useful engine. And so we would always wonder, well, in this episode, is Thomas going to be a useful engine or not? The reality is, for the trains to be useful to Sir Topham Hatt, they had to be aligned with his mission. His mission was the trains run on time, no confusion, no delays. If their mission was, I want to do whatever I want, I don't care if I'm on time, I don't care if I cause confusion, then they wouldn't be useful to him. But as long as they were aligned with Sir Topham Hatt's mission, they were useful engines. And of course, the same is true for us. And it raises a question for us for our starting point this morning is this: is your life useful to God? Right, another way to think about that is my life aligned with the mission of God? Is your life useful to God? Now understand this. God can use anyone. In fact, if you read through the Bible from beginning to end, you're going to see this, that God uses all manner of people. He uses Nebuchadnezzar, completely godless man, horrible man. He uses Darius, another king from a foreign country who didn't worship at all, but God used them. God used Pontius Pilate. We don't often think of this, but Pontius Pilate was important in God's plan of redemption. God even used Judas Iscariot. God can use anyone, but that doesn't mean that anyone is useful. To be useful to God means there's something going on in my heart that has me aligned with Him. And in fact, Paul talked about this in another one of his books, in 2 Timothy 2. Let me just read this to you. It says, "Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed." That seems like a good thing, right? I want to be able to present myself to God unashamed. Now, in a great house, this is Paul using an illustration, there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honorable use and some for dishonorable. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honorable use. So what Paul is getting at here is he's saying, your life is a vessel that is used by God. But how you live, how you align yourself with Him determines whether your life is honorable or dishonorable. And this is what he says. He will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work. What Paul was saying to Timothy is, hey, Timothy, live in a way that your life is useful to God. Now, we've been working our way through the book of Philippians. And once we got to Philippians chapter 2, Paul started to talk about this idea of unity, being others-focused, not being self-centered, being humble, putting others above yourself. And then what he does in the rest of the chapter is he gives us 3 different examples of how someone might do that. The first example he gave us was the example of Jesus. Remember, he said, "Let your mind be the mind of Christ," who even though he was God, didn't think that was something he had to hold tightly to. He was willing to let it go and become like us so that he could save us. So that's the first example of being humble and putting others above yourself. The second example Paul gave is actually himself. And remember, last week we talked about this. He said, don't grumble, be okay with where you're at. But he uses his own life as an example that he was actually willing to die if that's what was going to be best for the Philippians. And now this week, as we get to the end of chapter 2, he's going to give us two more examples. It's Timothy and Epaphroditus. And these are two men who are with Paul as he's writing the book of Philippians. Timothy is Paul's companion. He's been going with him for a long time. He picked him up on one of his missionary journeys as a young man. And he said, I see some potential in this young man. And so he would take Timothy everywhere he went. And Timothy was in many ways Paul's right-hand man and Paul's fixer. He would send him to different churches that were having problems. And at this time, he's with Paul as Paul's writing the letter to the Philippians. But also with him is a man named Epaphroditus, who's actually from Philippi. He's the guy who came from Philippi to bring Paul a letter from the church of Philippians, as well as some money and to help take care of them. And he's been with Paul for a while, and now Paul is sending him back. He's going to carry this letter that Paul is writing back to the Philippians. But Paul is going to use these two men to show the Philippians what it means to put others first. What it means to humbly prefer others. Just like he commanded at the beginning of the chapter, he's going to show how Timothy and Epaphroditus are examples of this. And as you read from Philippians 2:19 to 30, you see Paul talking first about Timothy and then about Epaphroditus. You look at these two young men and you say to yourself, these guys are an example of what it means to be useful to God. Because they've chosen to live in a way that is useful to Him. They've chosen to align themselves with God. And so what I want to do this morning is I want us to look at the example of Timothy and the example of Epaphroditus. Proverbs tells us over and over again that we gain wisdom by watching the wise. We learn from the example of the wise, and so we're going to try to do that this morning. And what I want us to do is I want us to observe this morning 5 marks of a useful life. All right? 5 marks of a useful life that we discover in Philippians 2:19 to 30. Here's the first one. Someone who lives a useful life to God, they bring joy to everyone around them. In Philippians 2:19, Paul says, I hope in the Lord Jesus, he's talking to the Philippians, to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. So Paul says, Timothy is going to go and he's going to visit you, and that's going to bring joy to me. Later on in the chapter, in verse 28, he says, I am the more eager to send him, and now he's talking about Epaphroditus, therefore that you may rejoice at seeing him again. So both Timothy and Epaphroditus are what we would call bringers of joy. Joy is so important in the Bible. Joy is so important to who we are because joy always accompanies the good news that God has. Remember when the angels came to the shepherds? What did they say? Jesus is born. This is joy for the whole world. Nehemiah said that the joy of the Lord is our strength. And as we've been reading through the book of Philippians, and we're going to see it even more and more in the next couple of chapters, we see the word joy and rejoice over and over again because joy is so critical. And what Paul is saying about these two guys is when they walk into the room, they bring joy. Now, you know what I'm talking about when I talk about someone who brings joy when they walk into the room, right? Because there are people who they walk into the room and the room lights up. And there are people who they walk into the room and all of the air is sucked out of the room. And in fact, you can go to a restaurant and depending on who your server is, have a radically different experience. Right? You can go to the same restaurant, same menu, same food, same kitchen. And if your server is full of joy and they bring joy to everything, you have a fantastic experience. But you could have the same food, the same chef, and have a server who is sour, right? They look like they just drank a gallon of prune juice before they came to your table. And they have nothing good to say, and they're not friendly, and you walk away and you don't remember the food, you remember the server. Because they took all the joy out of the room. And sometimes we as Christians forget this. That a sour Christian is not useful to God. So, sometimes we walk around as Christians and we say, oh, I am so joyful. So glad that Jesus saved me. That's not joy. Now remember, joy is not rooted in our circumstances. Because Paul over and over in Philippians talks about how joyful he is and how he's rejoicing. And he's in prison, and he's maybe on death row. He doesn't know if he's going to live or die. And yet he still has joy because joy is not rooted in our circumstances. It's rooted in what Jesus has done for us. In fact, I was talking to someone before the service, and they said this exact same thing. I can be joyful today because I have Jesus. It really doesn't matter what else is going on in my life. If I have Jesus, I can have joy. And so we as Christians, we can be people who bring joy to everyone around us because we have Jesus. And if I want to be useful to God in my life, then I need to be someone who's bringing joy to everyone around me. Number two, they are always concerned about others. Someone who lives a life that is useful to God is always concerned about others. Look what Paul says about Timothy. This is exactly how he describes him in verse 20. He says, "For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare." Paul says, Timothy cares deeply about you, Philippians. He is genuinely concerned. Now, we know people in life, you do, who are only concerned about their own welfare, right? You know these people. They only care about themselves. But there are also people in life who will pretend to care about you, but it's really only for themselves, right? It's like, I'm going to pretend to care about you as long as you give me what I want. As long as you do for me what I want you to do, as long as you act the way I want you to act, then I'm going to pretend to care about you. But the moment you're not beneficial to me, I'm not going to care about you anymore. That is not genuine concern. Timothy has genuine concern for the Philippians, which means this: he cares about them regardless of what they can do for him. And isn't this the example of Jesus? Because Jesus cared for us. Jesus came to earth for us, and there was nothing that we could do for him. There was nothing that we could offer him. And yet he came and he lived and he died for us. And so what Paul is saying is Timothy genuinely cares for you. Remember 2 weeks ago, we talked about 3 words that are helpful for us. They are the words need, deserve, and expect. And we talked about how so often I am so focused on what I need, what I deserve, and what I expect from you. And when that's what I'm thinking about all of the time, I'm going to be focused on myself. But if I want to have the mind of Christ, I no longer worry so much about what I need, I think about what you need. I'm no longer concerned with what it is that I deserve or think I deserve. I'm no longer concerned about what I expect from you. I'm much more concerned in doing what I can to provide for you what you need, what you deserve, what you expect. This is the mind of Christ. And this is the mind of Timothy. And Paul says, if you want to be useful to God, this is the mindset you need, to be genuinely concerned for people around you. Number 3 is the flip side of that one. Someone who is useful to God doesn't seek their own interests. Paul goes on in the next verse. He says, look, the problem is, first he talks about Epaphroditus. Let's look at that in verse 26. It says, he, Epaphroditus, has been longing for you all, and he has been distressed. Now this is one of my favorite verses in all of Philippians. Because Epaphroditus is with Paul. He's from Philippi. So the Philippians are all his friends. He goes to church with them. But he's with Paul right now. And listen to this. He has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death. Notice what Paul doesn't say. He doesn't say Epaphroditus has been distressed because he is ill. In fact, he's ill near to death. Now, if I'm ill near to death, that would be distressing for me. Right? And it would be for you. But Epaphroditus isn't concerned about himself. He's worried about the Philippians because they heard that he was sick. And he doesn't want them to be anxious. Now remember, this is before the internet. This is before phones. The news travels very slowly. So they heard he was sick, and now they don't know what's going to happen to him. And so Epaphroditus is distressed for the sake of them. He's not worried about himself. In verse 21 of this chapter, Paul says, everybody seeks their own interests, except for Timothy and except for Epaphroditus. The reality is, I cannot be self-focused and Christ-focused. I cannot be self-focused and others-focused. I can't see the world around me, and I can't see the people around me the way Jesus does if I'm always focused on myself. You know, every championship basketball team has this guy, right? They're not the big name. They're not the star. They don't score all the points. In fact, they probably have very little statistics. But they're the ones that do the dirty work. They play the defense. They get the rebounds. They dive for the loose balls. And while we may never know their name, they are an integral part of the team. This is the attitude that Paul is saying Epaphroditus has. This is the attitude that Timothy has. They don't care about recognition. They don't care about whether people are excited about them. They simply want to serve others. They're not focused on themselves. Number 4, someone who has a useful life is known for gospel service. This is what Paul says about Timothy. He says, you know Timothy's proven worth. This is verse 22. How as a son with a father, he has served with me in the gospel. So here's what Timothy did. Timothy, for Paul, he was the fixer, right? So Paul sent him to so many places. He sent him to Corinth. He sent him to Ephesus. He's about to send him to Philippi. At another time, he sent him to Thessalonica. I wanted to include that one because it's fun to say. But he sent him everywhere. And everywhere he sent him, it was because there was something going on in the church. And Paul said, Timothy, I want you to go help this church, fix this church. Okay, get them all set. And so he sends them to him to all these places. And everywhere Timothy goes, he does the same thing. Everywhere Timothy goes, he does everything he can to point as many people to Jesus. That's why Paul says he has served with me in the gospel. Because everything that Timothy does is designed to point people to Jesus. This is what gospel service is. Gospel service means that I take what God has given to me and I use it for God's agenda. Or if we wanted to say as a church, how does this look? It means that we take what God has given to us and use it to fulfill the mission he has called us to do. I know sometimes we hear something like that, say, yeah, but God hasn't really given me a lot, right? I can't get up and speak in front of people. I don't have a great voice. I can't sing. I'm not even sure I could be an usher because I'd probably trip down the aisle. God hasn't given me a lot of gifts. And we actually see this often in the Bible. You remember Moses, right? We think of Moses as this amazing guy. Right? Moses, he did so much. He was incredible. He led the people out of Egypt. He was so amazing. Moses thought of himself as a guy with no gifts. He's out in the wilderness. His life is a disaster, right? He lived in the palace, but he had to leave and run away because he killed a guy. And now he's living out the rest of his life in the wilderness watching sheep. He feels like he's gone from the mountaintop to the valley. He doesn't think he's capable of much. And then he meets God. Right, burning bush. He's like, whoa, that's crazy. He goes and he talks to it. God says, remove your shoes, you're on holy ground. So Moses does. And then God and Moses have this interchange. And God's like, Moses, I want you to go back and I want you to set my people free. And Moses is like, whoa, God, you've got the wrong guy. I can't do that. And God's like, no, you're going to go to Pharaoh and you're going to tell him, hey, let my people go. And Moses says, God, I don't talk so good. So I have a hard time talking. I'm not the guy to do this. And so God says, Moses, what's that you got in your hand? And remember, Moses is a shepherd, right? So what we like to say is he's got a shepherd's staff in his hand. Because that sounds like kind of fancy. He's got a shepherd's staff. He's got a stick. So God says, Moses, what's that in your hand? It's a stick. Now, there are sticks everywhere. We don't think of sticks as being that big of a deal. But God says, Moses, I want you to throw that stick on the ground. The stick becomes a snake instantly. Oh, and then God says, pick that up, Moses. Now here's where I might have said, God, are you sure? I don't want to pick up the snake, but Moses does. He picks up the snake, and immediately it's a stick again. And God says to Moses, if I can do that, then I can use you. Just take that stick with you, let's see what can happen. So Moses takes the stick with him, and he goes back to Egypt, and he puts the stick out over the Nile River, and it turns to blood. And then later frogs come out of it. And over again, Moses uses this stick to bring these plagues. And ultimately, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh says, okay, fine, take my people, let them go. And they get trapped. And the Red Sea is on one side of them, and Pharaoh's army is on the other side of them. And the people are like, way to go, Moses. Now we're going to die. And so Moses takes his stick. It's just a stick. And he puts it out over the Red Sea. Waters part. They go through, waters crash down, greatest army in the world at that time is defeated, and the people are free. And how did God do it? With a stick. You see, sometimes we look at ourselves and go, I don't have much, all I got is a stick. But do you know what God can do with a stick? Because he wasn't done yet, right? That same stick, Moses used it to hit a rock and water came out. God over and over takes the things that we think are insignificant and he can use them in amazing ways if we're willing to let him. And so to be gospel service means I say, what has God given to me? And how can I use that for him? How can I allow him to work through me? Even if I think I don't have much, even if I don't think I am much, God can use me if I'm willing to do everything I can to point other people to Jesus. And so what does it mean to be a life that is useful to God? It means that I am known for gospel service. I take what God has given me and I use it to point others to him. One more thing, number 5, is someone who is useful to God perseveres through difficulty. Look at the end of the chapter, verse 30. Paul says, so receive him, he's talking about Epaphroditus, receive him in the Lord with all joy, and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. You see, Epaphroditus brought this gift to Paul from the Philippians, and we'll see in chapter 4 that it was a great gift. But what he also did is he brought himself. Like all the Philippians couldn't come to see Paul, so that's what was lacking was this physical presence. But he brought that. Now, we don't know exactly when or how Epaphroditus got sick. Maybe it was on the journey. Maybe it was once he was there. But whatever this illness was, he almost died from it, but he persevered through it. And he kept going and he kept serving because he loved Paul and because he loved Jesus. You see, how much I care about something, how important I think something is, will determine how much I persevere. If I think something's not important, I probably won't persevere. I was back in Ohio last week, and I did like a food tour of all my favorite places, right? All of it unhealthy. So I went to Skyline Chili, which some of you know what that is. It's fantastic. I went to get some Dots fried chicken because it's the best fried chicken I've ever had. And I had one more place I wanted to go. It's called the Whipty-Doo. It's an ice cream place. It's about a half an hour from the church I was at there, but it is the best ice cream I've ever had. And my plan was, on Friday night, after I did the wedding rehearsal, I was going to go to the Whipty-Doo. I didn't make it. And the reason I didn't make it is because something better came up. One of my friends was like, hey, I can get us a tea time at 6:30. We can get 9 in before dark. You want to do it? I'm like, yeah. What the choice is, my friend or ice cream? So even though the original plan was ice cream, I didn't persevere because I didn't think it was important. But if I think something's important, I'm going to figure out a way to get it done, right? So when COVID hit, our son was out here, and we were on the other side of the country. And we're like, what do we do now? How do we get him home? Because we also got to get his car here somehow. So we worked it all out. We figured out. So we rented a car, and Marianne, Emma, and I drove all the way to Boise. And we were going to meet him in Boise, and he was going to drive from here to Boise. But, he was in love. And he said, I didn't get out of the house as soon as I could. So we're like, okay, well, we'll keep driving. So we drove somewhere into eastern Oregon, and we finally met up there. And then we returned the rental car to Boise. And then we all got into his car, which was a Honda Accord. And so the 4 of us were in a Honda Accord with all of Liam's college stuff. And we drove from Boise all the way to Duluth, Minnesota, because that's where Emma's car was. Her college shut down while she was on spring break. So we had to go get her car there in Duluth, and then we drove from there back home. I never thought 4 adults could drive across the country with a whole bunch of stuff in a Honda Accord, but it can be done. And do you know why we were willing to do it? It was a little uncomfortable and it was a little difficult because we love our son. And when you love something, it's worth persevering for. Some of you know the name Desmond Doss. He was a soldier in World War II. There's a movie about him called Hacksaw Ridge. And he's a guy who saved 75 men in one battle, even though he was unwilling to carry a gun. And he saved 75 men, even though he himself was shot. And he won all kinds of awards. He won the Bronze Star. He won the Purple Heart. He won all kinds of awards. But when he tells the story of what was happening that day and that night, he says he simply just kept praying, Lord, help me save one more. That's the prayer of someone who wants to persevere. Lord, help me save one more. That's the prayer of someone who wants to be useful to God. Because you see, when it's important to us, we persevere. So here's the big question for us this morning. How important is usefulness to you? How important to you is it that you are useful to God? Because if it's important, you'll find ways to persevere. You'll find ways to pray to the prayer, Lord, help me save one more. You'll find ways to bring joy into the lives of everyone around you. You'll find ways to elevate others above yourself if being useful is important to you. So let's get really practical, okay? So Timothy and Epaphroditus, they didn't start out this way. They're people just like us. And normal people naturally think of themselves first. But Timothy and Epaphroditus, they wanted to be like Jesus. And they were discipled by Paul, and they learned and they grew and they figured out how to discipline themselves. There were days they had when they didn't feel like being others focused. There were days they had when they're like, I want to do what's good for me. But they chose instead to grow these habits, to discipline themselves. So if we want to learn from their example, what can we do? I'm going to give you a super practical way to start developing the kind of habits in your life that Timothy and Epaphroditus had in theirs. And we're going to call this the 1, 2, 3 to usefulness. Okay? Super easy to remember. Here we go. Number 1, identify one area of your life where you want to be more useful. This is probably going to be some kind of a relationship. It might be in your family, in your marriage. It might be at work. It might be at school. It might be in some hobby or club that you're in. It might be a sport. It might be your neighborhood. It might be church. It can be anything. But think of one area in your life where you have some relationships and you're saying to yourself, I want to be more useful to God in those relationships. Just one. We're not going to try to fix everything at once. Pick one. Okay? Number 2, choose 2 useful actions. Okay, so these actions, they need to be action-oriented and others-focused. So something like, I want to bring joy into the lives of others. Or I want to serve others. Or I want to give something away to someone else. Something like that. Just simple actions that you can do. Think of 2. All right, and here's number 3. Complete them 3 times this week. That's it. Not every day. Not over and over, just 3 times this week, try to complete them. Nobody's perfect. You're going to have good days. You're going to have bad days. But try 3 times to do this. And here's why. It's been said that first we form our habits, and then our habits form us. And what I want us to think about is, how can I start forming habits of serving? How can I start forming habits of generosity? How can I start forming habits of selflessness? Because when I develop in my life the habits of selflessness and generosity and serving, I will be amazed at what God can do through me. When I make myself useful to Him, He will use me in unexpected ways. Let's pray. Father, thank you for loving us. Thank you for the example of Jesus. Thank you for the truth and the wisdom of your word. Help us this week to be useful people. Help us this week to love others the way you love them, to see others the way you see them. In your name, amen.